Hello. So COP27 has finally drawn to a close. The final agreement and what's called the cover text, so the kind of agreement coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, was agreed the early hours of Saturday morning. So the negotiators must be absolutely shattered in terms of a couple of nights of working through the night and very little sleep. So the big news and the thing that's attracting a lot of coverage right now is a big success on this issue of loss and damage. So the impacts of climate change, the negative impacts of climate change, which are already occurring, and agreement for a fund to address loss and damage. This is something which has been on the kind of on the agenda outside of the COPs for about 30 years in terms of the impacts of climate change already happening, and there needing to be a fund to help people who are suffering those losses, whether it's through insurance of a lost crop or rebuilding flooded houses, etc. So it's finally, yes, it's going to have a fund to support it. There's no detail yet in terms of which countries will fund it. A lot of the discussions and the negotiations were around ensuring that that included as wide an array of countries as possible. So looking at big economies like China and India being part of providing the funds to the most vulnerable nations. We will see in the coming year, the work starts now basically on establishing who will pay into that fund. So which emitters, obviously the rich countries in the global north will be part of it, but whether it will include those kind of big transition economies, as they're sometimes called, like India and China, and also who will be able to use it and how. So what will constitute the most vulnerable nations and how the fund will work. But it's a massive breakthrough in terms of the loss and damage agenda, and something which kind of held this COP together. Ultimately, it looked like it might fall down and reach no agreement by the end of the 2 weeks. What it kind of has done is restore faith and trust, I guess, across the global north and the global south, that COPs are worth it and that you can actually reach agreement on some of these key issues. So that's the good news. There's quite a lot to be worried about by COP27. So we saw a lot of debate around the Paris climate goals and the commitment to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius this century, and pursue efforts to limit them to 1.5, so that 1.5 Paris goal, which is talked about a lot. There was definitely some efforts to backslide on that during these negotiations from certain nations. We've still got that commitment within the text, but it's been moved to the science bit of the text, so it's arguably a bit less overt than it was coming out of Glasgow. More importantly, though, there's really not much in the text, the kind of 10-page document, the cover text from Sharm, which indicates more ambition, more action on cutting emissions. Nothing that gets us nearer to the goals of 1.5 and 2. There was a push during negotiations to try and get into the text a commitment to phase down all fossil fuels. So not just coal, which was in the Glasgow pact, but also gas, so natural gas and oil, and that isn't in here. We've still got the kind of the same kind of language really of phasing down coal, but for gas and oil, there isn't stronger language. So that's really disappointing. One of the really worrying things about the text actually is that in the energy section, there's now a term in there around using low emission energy, which is a very vague term, and the risk there is that opens up the case for more natural gas. So saying that, well, natural gas has a lower carbon footprint than coal, and it does, but it's still not compatible with our Paris climate goals. Certainly new gas exploitation and use just will not allow us to meet the Paris climate goals. So that's really worrying in the text. It depends, I guess, on how you view low emission energy, what you think it is, but it does open up a potential loophole, I guess, there for more natural gas that we cannot afford in a climate emergency. That all sounds a little bit bleak, but there are some, I guess, positive steps also in the text, just in terms of more definition around key issues that we face, and real acknowledgement about how climate change is interlinked with things like the energy and food crises that the world is facing at the moment, all nations are facing. And so we've got new sections within this cover text specific on things like food and food security and the link with climate. Oceans and forests are in there in terms of specific sections, and that's really crucial. It really exemplifies those connections between climate, nature, and food security. And it's really timely because we have COP15. So this is another conference of the parties, but this is the biodiversity COP, so the nature COP, really important one, starting in Montreal in Canada next month. And so at least it gives a little bit of a platform in terms of the connections and the kind of the codependency of these United Nations processes and the negotiations. Reflecting on the last couple of weeks, and yeah, we came into this COP, I guess, the negotiators, most of the climate folk around the world, were pretty low expectations because of that attention crisis that we've got on climate due to things like the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crises around the world. And so you could say the outcome on loss and damage, and that fund for loss and damage is way above expectations, a real breakthrough on that particular facet. But beyond that, it seems to have been more a case of trying to prevent backsliding compared to what was agreed in Glasgow a year ago at COP26. So trying to defend some of those pledges, those targets, and some of the wording around, particularly around mitigating our emissions, rather than getting new and stronger ambition and action. I think COP27, it'll be remembered for loss and damage in terms of the new fund, yes, and that's a real positive, but also real loss and damage in terms of our chances of meeting the Paris climate goals, real damage and potentially ultimately loss of any chance of meeting that 1.5 goal. So definitely a mixed bag of a COP. Eyes will already be looking towards COP28 in Dubai, in United Arab Emirates next year. Hopefully that will deliver a lot more clarity and its funding mechanism for loss and damage. But boy, I hope it also delivers some real progress in terms of greater pledges, greater action in terms of mitigation. Thank you.